Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm 78 years old, and I need to tell you what happened to me last Christmas, right in my own son's dining room, in front of the whole family. My daughter-in-law stood up between the pumpkin pie and the coffee pot and announced, smiling like she was handing me a gift, that next year I would be moving into a nursing home. She didn't ask me first. She didn't ask my son first. She just said it out loud in front of my grandchildren over the good china I'd given them for their wedding, like it was already settled, like I was a piece of furniture somebody had already found a new spot for in another room of the house, a decision made in a meeting I was never invited to attend. I remember the exact weight of that silence, how even the old dog under the table seemed to sense something was wrong and pressed his warm body against my ankle. I sat there in my good navy blue sweater, the one I only wear on Christmas, the one Walter used to say brought out my eyes, and I felt the whole table go quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone else already knows something that you don't. My son looked down at his plate and pushed his fork around in the cranberry sauce like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. My grandchildren looked at their mother, then at me, then back at their plates, sensing something in the air, even if they couldn't have named it yet, the way children always feel, a storm before the grown-ups admit one is coming. And I just sat there, with my hands folded in my lap, spine straight, chin level, because that is what you learn to do when you have spent 60 years being the strong one in every single room you ever walked into, even the rooms that were quietly trying to walk you out of them. I have buried a husband. I raised a son mostly by myself, working 2 jobs some years just to keep the lights on and his shoes fitting right, sewing patches into the knees of his jeans by lamplight after he'd gone to bed, counting out grocery money at the kitchen table on Sunday nights so it would stretch until the next paycheck. I built something real out of almost nothing with these 2 hands back when nobody thought a widow could run a business, back when bank managers looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong office and needed to be shown the door, back when I had to bring Walter's old ledgers with me just to be taken seriously for 5 minutes. And in that one moment, sitting at a table I had quietly helped pay for more times than anyone in that house ever knew, I understood something that broke my heart a little. Right there under the string lights David had put up the exact way his father used to. My family had already decided without me what the rest of my life was going to look like. Nobody had asked me one single question, not about the house, not about my health, not about what I actually wanted for whatever years I had left. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who are supposed to love you and still felt completely invisible? Have you ever had someone decide your whole future for you, smiling the entire time, calling it kindness, handing you a decision already wrapped and bowed like a present you never asked for and never got to return? I would guess some of you watching this tonight know exactly what that feels like. Maybe it wasn't a nursing home. Maybe it was your house, your car, your own money, your own name on a paper somewhere, your own doctor's appointment that somebody else scheduled without telling you first, your own bedroom that somebody else measured for a new tenant. But that feeling of being talked about instead of talked to, that feeling is the same no matter what the decision was actually about, and it sits in your chest the exact same cold, heavy way every single time it happens. If you are watching this from your own kitchen table tonight, or from your car in a parking lot on your break, headlights off, radio low, or curled up in a quiet living room after everyone else has gone to bed, I want you to know that I see you, and this story is for you. Every single word of it, no matter what your version of my Christmas dinner looked like. If it means something to you, hitting that subscribe button doesn't cost you 1 single cent, not 1 penny out of your pocket, but it helps this channel keep finding women like me and telling our stories out loud, so more people out there know they are not alone tonight wherever they happen to be sitting. Subscribe if you can and stay with me a while longer, because this story does not end the way my daughter-in-law thought it would that night, not even close to it. Let me back up a little so you understand who I actually am and why that dining room moment hurt the way it did, all the way down to the bone, past the surface of it. My husband Walter and I got married young, back when nobody had any money, and we scraped together everything we had, every dollar from 2 years of him working the loading dock at night, to open a small home care office above a hardware store in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 1 room with a metal desk and a rotary phone that rang more than either of us expected it to that first winter. We started by sending nurses and aides into people's houses to take care of their elderly parents. Back before anybody called it an industry, back when it was just neighbors helping neighbors for a little bit of money and a lot of trust. Walter kept the books at night after his shift ended, ink smudged on the side of his hand. I did almost everything else. The hiring, the families, the late-night phone calls when someone's mother had fallen, and there was nobody else in the world to call. When Walter got sick, cancer, the slow kind that takes years instead of months, I nursed him myself right up until the end, changing his bandages at the kitchen table, learning to give injections with my hands, shaking the first few times until they finally steadied. Sitting beside his bed some nights, just listening to him breathe to make sure he still was, while still running that business and raising our son David alone in every practical sense that mattered. Nobody handed me anything, not one single thing, not one favor, not one shortcut. I learned insurance codes at my kitchen table at midnight with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me and my reading glasses sliding down my nose. I learned how to fire someone kindly and how to comfort a grieving family at 2 in the morning when their father had just passed in his sleep down the hall. Eventually, that little home care service grew into something bigger, a real assisted living facility, the kind with a name on a sign and a parking lot and a director, built brick by brick out of everything Walter and I had scraped and saved and refused to give up on. I kept my name off most of the paperwork, quietly, on purpose, because I never wanted people treating me differently because of what I owned, or looking at me and seeing dollar signs instead of a person who remembered every family story. By the time David grew up, married Jessica, and had my 2 grandchildren, Ethan and Mia, I had mostly stepped back from daily operations. Though I still own the majority of that company, a business now worth well over $4 million on paper, still walked those halls every week in my sensible shoes, still knew every resident by name and most of their birthdays and their favorite hymns besides. David never talked about my business much at family dinners, and honestly, neither did I, because talking about money at the table felt vulgar to me, something my own mother had taught me decades before over her own modest kitchen table. I thought that was humility. I thought that was keeping money separate from love, the way you're supposed to do it if you were raised right. I did not yet understand that my own silence was about to be used against me, quietly, patiently, by the one person in that family who had never once asked me a real question about my life, my history, or how I'd actually spent the last 50 years of it. It didn't start at Christmas. It started almost a year before that. In small comments Jessica made so gently you almost couldn't call them cruel, comments dropped into ordinary conversation like pebbles into a pond, small ripples you didn't notice until they'd already reached the shore and washed something away. She would say things like, "Dorothy, don't you think that big house is an awful lot for one person to manage? All that yard, all those stairs, all that upkeep for one woman alone." She would say it while refilling my coffee, while smiling, while doing something that looked like care from across the room, her voice warm as fresh bread out of the oven. The first few times I actually agreed with her a little, nodding along over my teacup. Maybe the house was too much. Maybe I did need help with the gutters and the yard now that my knees weren't what they used to be on cold mornings. I had no idea those small comments were the first bricks in a wall she was building around my whole life, one polite, reasonable sentence at a time. Then it became about my driving. Jessica mentioned more than once at more than one dinner that she'd heard I was going slower than usual at the four-way stop near the pharmacy, that maybe my eyes weren't what they used to be, that maybe it was time to start thinking about giving up the keys before something happened. I have never had an accident in 56 years of driving. Not one ticket, not one fender bender, not one close call worth even mentioning at a dinner table. But somehow that story kept getting repeated at family dinners. A little more dramatic each time it traveled from mouth to mouth around that table until my own grandson Ethan asked me, quite innocently, his eyes wide and worried, if I was scared to drive anymore, Grandma. A 10-year-old boy asking his grandmother if she's scared, his small hand finding mine under the table. That's when I first felt something cold settle low in my stomach and simply stay there, quiet, waiting. The visits with my grandchildren started shrinking a little at a time, always explained away with a reason that sounded almost too reasonable to argue with out loud. "We don't want to tire her out," Jessica would tell David, loud enough for me to hear from the next room, but phrased so sweetly that objecting would have made me sound difficult, ungrateful even, petty about my own grandchildren. I would catch myself rehearsing, in the shower, in the car, exactly how I might ask for more time with Ethan and Mia without sounding desperate and never quite finding the courage to actually say it out loud to her face. Sunday dinners at their house went from every week to every other week to once a month, if I happened to remember to ask, if I happened to catch Jessica in a mood to say yes to the request. I would sit at home on Sundays that used to be full of noise and small feet running through the hallway, full of Ethan's laughter over cartoons and Mia asking me to braid her hair just so. And the silence in my own house started to feel like a punishment I hadn't earned, a sentence handed down without ever once standing trial for anything. The phrase I heard most, over and over, dressed up different ways each time so it never quite sounded the same twice in a row, was, "It's for your own good. It's for your own good if you don't drive at night anymore, Dorothy. It's for your own good if David handles the finances now, just to simplify things for everyone. It's for your own good if we cut back on how much you're doing. You've earned some rest after all these years." Nobody ever explained what good they meant exactly, or good for whom. And I started noticing, lying awake some nights, turning it over and over in my mind like a stone in my palm, that every single time somebody said those words to me, what actually happened afterward was that I lost a little more control over my own life, and somebody else quietly gained a little more, without ever once framing it that way out loud where anyone could object. I remember one dinner where Jessica and David were discussing, right in front of me, passing dishes back and forth like this was the most ordinary conversation in the world, whether I should still be allowed to keep my own checkbook. Like I was a teenager asking for the car keys instead of a 77-year-old woman who had run payroll for 40 employees for over a decade without ever once being late on a single paycheck. They talked about me in the third person the entire time, as though I were a piece of the wallpaper in that dining room. Does she still write checks all right these days? Does she remember to pay the utility bill on time every month? I sat there at my own son's table, my coffee going cold in front of me untouched, and realized I had somehow become a topic instead of a person in that conversation, and neither of them seemed to notice anything wrong with that at all, not even a small flicker of discomfort. If you've made it this far in my story, and something in your chest is tightening up a little because you recognize this, because somebody in your own life has started talking about you instead of to you, treating your opinions like they're optional extras nobody really needs, I want you to do one thing for me right now. Subscribe to this channel for free right now if you can manage it, before life gets busy and you forget you meant to. It helps more than you know, and it means somebody out there is going to hear a story like mine right when they need it most. Maybe on a night just like tonight, sitting exactly where you're sitting right now, feeling exactly what you're feeling. What hurt the most wasn't any single comment, taken alone on its own. It was the pattern underneath all of it, the slow, quiet message that I was becoming a problem to be managed instead of a mother to be loved and consulted like an adult. I would catch Jessica watching me sometimes, at the sink, at the table, over the rim of her wine glass, with this expression that wasn't unkind exactly, but was calculating, the way you look at furniture when you're deciding if it still fits the room, or if it's time for something newer and more convenient. And my son David, my sweet, soft-hearted David, who I had raised entirely on my own after Walter passed, staying up with him through fevers and heartbreaks and every skinned knee alike, just kept nodding along with whatever she said, eyes down at his plate, like a man who had given up his own voice a long time ago and half forgotten he ever had one to begin with. I understood some of why David went along with it, even if it still stung every single time it happened. Every single dinner it repeated itself in some new disguise. Jessica's father, Gary, had money, real money, the kind that builds swimming pools and pays for private school tuition without so much as blinking at the invoice, and he had quietly propped up David and Jessica more than once, a down payment on their house over in the Brookstone Estates neighborhood, a business loan another time when David's own venture had stumbled badly, David depended on Gary's goodwill and, by extension, on Jessica's approval in a way that made him afraid to disagree with her about almost anything, including his own mother, including the woman who had sacrificed her own 20s and 30s so he could have a childhood at all instead of an empty house after school. I don't think my son ever set out to be weak. I think he just slowly, quietly traded his backbone for a comfortable life, one small silence at a time, one swallowed objection at a time, until there was almost nothing left of the boy who used to defend me on the playground without a second thought. By that November, just weeks before Christmas, I had started keeping a little notebook, the kind with a marbled cover you buy at the drugstore for $1, tucked in the drawer of my nightstand where nobody would think to look. Not out of any grand plan, just out of habit, the same habit that had served me my whole working life. Back when I documented every incident report at Meadowbrook without fail, no matter how small, I wrote down dates, I wrote down exactly what was said, and by whom, word for word as best I could remember it later, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside the page. Not because I intended to use it against anyone in some dramatic way, but because something in me, some old instinct from decades of running a business and reading people across a negotiating table, told me I needed to remember things clearly because somebody was going to try to rewrite this story later, soften it, explain it away as concern, and I did not intend to let them rewrite it without a record sitting quietly and patiently in a drawer. The first real crack in the surface came at Thanksgiving, a month before Christmas, when Jessica brought a folder to dinner, right there on the table between the turkey platter and the gravy boat, like it belonged there. An actual folder, glossy printed brochures inside for 3 different senior living communities in our area. The kind of brochures with soft focus photos of silver-haired couples laughing over checkers in a sunlit room. She set it on the table next to the cranberry sauce like it was a normal thing to do, like she was sharing vacation photos from a trip to the coast last summer. "This is just so we can start thinking ahead," she said, looking right at me with that same warm, reasonable smile she always used, right before saying something devastating, a smile I had started to dread the way you dread a phone ringing after midnight, knowing before you answer that nothing good comes at that hour. One of those brochures, I noticed with a strange cold feeling spreading slowly through my chest like ice water, was for Meadowbrook Senior Living, the very facility I had built with my own hands over 30 years, the one I still owned the majority of, the one where I personally knew every single staff member by name, from the head nurse down to the young man who mowed the lawn on Tuesdays and always waved at my car. Jessica had no idea, not the faintest flicker of recognition crossing her face. She pointed at the photo on the cover, a beautiful stone building with manicured gardens I had chosen the flowers for myself over several seasons, and said, "This one especially, Dorothy. It's supposed to be the best one in the whole county. So clean, such a good reputation. You'd be so well taken care of there. Wouldn't that be nice for you, finally?" I remember holding my coffee cup very still, both hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, like it was the only steady thing in the room, because my hands wanted to shake. And not from age. Not one single bit from age. I had spent decades making sure that building had a good reputation, hiring the right nurses, firing the ones who cut corners, no matter how it made me feel afterward lying awake, sitting up nights worrying about resident safety long after most owners would have handed it off to somebody else and stopped caring altogether about the details. And here was my own daughter-in-law, holding up a glossy photo of my life's work like a real estate listing torn from a magazine, recommending it to me like a stranger recommending a nice hotel she'd once stayed at on vacation, with absolutely no idea what she was actually looking at, or who had built every square foot of it from a single rented office above a hardware store. I didn't say anything that night. Not one word about owning the place, not even a hint dropped into the conversation. I told myself it was because I didn't want to make a scene at Thanksgiving in front of the children over the good tablecloth my mother had left me, but if I'm honest with myself now, sitting here telling you this story, it was something else too, something harder to admit. Some old, stubborn part of me wanted to see exactly how far this would go before I stepped in, wanted to watch the whole thing unfold with my own eyes, rather than stop it early out of politeness or fear of conflict. I wanted to know the truth of what my family actually thought of me when they believed I had no power at all, no leverage, nothing but my own good behavior to offer them. That is not a comfortable thing to admit, wanting to test the people you love that way. But grief and humiliation make you do strange, careful, deliberate things you never thought you'd be capable of doing. A week later, I overheard David and Jessica through the kitchen wall of their own house. While I was folding laundry in the next room, warm towels still smelling of fabric softener against my hands, thinking they'd forgotten I was even there at all that afternoon, Jessica was saying that once I was settled somewhere, they could finally rent out my house or sell it outright and use the money to finally build the pool addition Jessica had wanted for years, the one she'd been showing David pictures of on her phone for months at breakfast. She said it so casually, like planning a vacation to somewhere warm and sunny. My house. The house Walter and I bought with money we saved for 11 years, cent by cent, skipping vacations, mending our own clothes late at night, was being discussed as a future pool fund while I stood 20 feet away holding my grandson's laundry against my chest like a shield. David's response was the part that hurt the most, more than anything Jessica said that whole evening put together. He didn't defend me. He didn't say, wait, that's Mom's house. That's Mom's decision to make, not ours to plan around. He just said quietly, almost tiredly, we'll figure it out once she's moved, like I was a piece of paperwork waiting to be processed, instead of the woman who used to sit up with him at 2 a.m. when he had the flu as a boy, pressing cool washcloths to his forehead until the fever broke. The woman who worked 2 jobs some years just so he could play baseball in the spring without worrying about the registration fee, who never once made him feel the weight of the sacrifice she was quietly making for him. That night, I drove home in the dark, hands steady on the wheel, my eyes at the 4-way stop working just fine, thank you very much, headlights cutting clean through the cold winter air, and I made a decision, quiet and calm. The same way I had made every important decision in my life, at kitchen tables, in hospital hallways, over paperwork nobody else in the world wanted to read closely. I was not going to scream, I was not going to make a scene, or beg, or remind anyone of everything I had sacrificed for this family across 5 decades. I was simply going to find out exactly where things stood, legally and factually, in black and white on paper, and then I was going to let this play out exactly as far as my family wanted to take it, all the way to the edge until the moment came when the truth itself could finally do the talking for me. If any part of this is landing hard for you tonight, if you've ever overheard people you love making plans around your life, like you weren't even in the room, like your own voice didn't count for anything at all, I want you to know that what you do with that pain next matters more than the pain itself ever will, in the end. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about women who found their voice again instead of disappearing quietly into somebody else's version of their life, subscribing to this channel is free, costs you nothing at all out of your pocket. And it truly helps keep these stories coming to people who need to hear them tonight, wherever they are. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I called my attorney, Susan Reyes, a sharp, patient woman who had handled Meadowbrook's legal matters for almost 15 years, and who I trusted the way you trust very few people in this life, the way you trust someone who has seen your worst paperwork and never once judged you for any of it. I told her everything, calmly, without embellishment, the way you'd report plain facts to a colleague across a desk. She listened without interrupting once, taking notes in that careful, slanted handwriting of hers, and when I finished, she simply asked me one question, leaning back slowly in her chair. Dorothy, do you actually want to stop this right now, today, or do you want to let it play out and then show them the truth all at once, later? I sat quiet for a long moment, looking out her office window at the gray parking lot, before I answered her honestly. I told her I wanted to let it play out. Not out of spite, though I won't pretend there wasn't some small human part of that in me if I'm being completely honest with you tonight, sitting here. But because some lessons only really land when people arrive at the truth on their own timeline, in their own moment of certainty, rather than having it handed to them early, just to spare their embarrassment down the road. Susan pulled every document related to Meadowbrook that week anyway. The operating agreement, the deed, The ownership record showing me as majority member of the LLC, tax filings going back a decade, all of it organized cleanly into one leather folder, tabbed and labeled the way she does everything in that office, just in case we needed it fast, on short notice without any scrambling at the last minute when it mattered most. Next, I called Nancy Ellison, the administrator who had run the daily operations of Meadowbrook for almost 20 years. Since back when it was still a fraction of its current size, back when we used to eat lunch together out of paper bags in my tiny cramped office, splitting a sandwich between the two of us while we argued over staffing schedules and never once raised our voices at each other. Nancy wasn't just an employee to me, not by a long shot, not after everything we'd been through together over 2 decades. She had sat beside me at Walter's funeral, held my hand through the whole service without letting go once. She knew every hard decision I'd ever made in that building, every resident we'd lost, every crisis we'd weathered together at 3 in the morning, and she knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what I owned and what it was worth, down to the last dollar and cent. When I told her what Jessica had done at Thanksgiving, Nancy went quiet on the phone for a second, and then she said, slow and deliberate, "Dorothy, honey, I don't think that woman has the faintest idea who she's actually talking to." I asked Nancy to do something specific for me, something I want you to understand I did not do lightly at all, something I thought about carefully for 2 full days before I even picked up the phone to call her. I asked her to prepare, quietly in advance, in case my family ever scheduled what people in the senior living world call an adaptation visit, a tour meant to help a new resident and their family get comfortable before move-in day arrives. I asked her to have the ownership documents ready, framed, presentable, laid out clearly on the front desk, not hidden in a drawer somewhere gathering dust for years. In case the day ever came when the truth needed to be shown to a room full of people all at once, instead of explained quietly to just one person over coffee, where it could be smoothed over and quietly forgotten by morning. If you're still with me tonight, sitting through all of this with me like a friend at my own kitchen table, I want to pause for just a second and say something that matters to me more than most of the story itself. Deciding to stay calm and let the truth come out in its own time isn't weakness, and it isn't revenge either, no matter what it might look like from the outside looking in. It's something else entirely, something closer to self-respect, to knowing your own worth doesn't need to be shouted from a rooftop to be real and lasting. If that idea means anything to you right now, please consider subscribing to this channel while you're thinking about it. It's completely free, and it helps this channel keep reaching people who need to hear that staying calm doesn't mean staying powerless. Not for one single second of your life. December came fast after that, the way December always does, full of school concerts and grocery lines, and the particular ache of a year ending whether you're ready for it or not yet. Jessica's small comments turned into something more organized, more clinical almost, more like a project plan than a conversation. She started using words like timeline and transition plan, business-like words that made my stomach turn every time, applied to my own life like I was a merger instead of a mother, like a quarterly project with a hard deadline attached to it. She mentioned at one dinner, passing the rolls without even looking up from her phone, that she had already spoken informally to someone at Meadowbrook about, quote, availability for next year, with absolutely no idea that the person she should have been talking to was sitting right across the table from her, eating her own pot roast in her own son's dining room. One evening, about 2 weeks before Christmas, I sat alone in my kitchen with Susan's folder open in front of me under the yellow light hanging over the table, reading through 30 years of my own life reduced to legal language, deed transfers, an operating agreement with my name typed cleanly at the top as majority member Dorothy Whitfield, in letters so small and ordinary for something that had cost me absolutely everything I had. I ran my finger over my own signature from decades ago, ink faded a little at the edges. The young widow who had walked into a bank alone in a borrowed coat and convinced a skeptical loan officer to take a chance on her against every instinct he probably had that day. I cried a little that night, not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to recognition, remembering exactly who I had always been underneath all this recent smallness they'd been quietly folding me into for months. The pressure kept building as Christmas got closer, day by day, like a held breath nobody would let out. Jessica started asking me in front of David small testing questions dressed up as helpfulness and concern, like whether I'd started going through my closets yet, whether I had any furniture I especially wanted to keep for, in her words, wherever I ended up next in life. Each question landed like a small stone dropped into still water, not painful alone, but the pile of them together grew heavy fast, heavier than she could possibly have known from her side of the table. I answered every single one calmly, pleasantly even, giving away absolutely nothing about what I knew, playing the exact role Jessica had already written for me in her head, the quiet, confused, cooperative old woman, slowly and gratefully accepting her fate without ever putting up a fight. 3 days before Christmas, Jessica announced over the phone, cheerful as anything, her voice bright with the particular pride of someone who believes they've organized something truly wonderful for everyone involved, that she'd arranged a special family visit to Meadowbrook for early January, what she called our adaptation visit, so I could, in her words, see how lovely it is and start feeling excited instead of scared about the whole thing ahead. She'd invited David's sister, my other grandchildren's cousins, even a couple of neighbors from down the street, framing it almost like an event, a small celebration of my supposed new chapter in life beginning. I said that sounded wonderful, dear, and thanked her for thinking of me, keeping my voice light and easy the whole time. And then I hung up the phone and called Nancy immediately to confirm every single document was ready and waiting. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The sky that particular deep blue it only gets in the dead of winter, and my son's house was full of the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey, full of the noise I used to hear every single Sunday before it got rationed down to almost nothing over the past year. Ethan and Mia ran to hug me at the door the second I walked in, their small arms wrapping around my coat before I'd even gotten it fully off, and for just a moment, holding those two children, breathing in the smell of their shampoo and warm skin, I almost forgot every hard thing that had happened over the last year entirely. Almost. Jessica greeted me warmly too, kissed my cheek, told me I looked wonderful in my navy blue sweater, and I thanked her, meaning every word of it, because she really had looked lovely that evening, and cruelty and kindness can live strangely close together in the very same person, sometimes in the very same breath, the very same smile. Dinner went beautifully at first, better than it had in months, maybe better than it had all year. David said grace, the same simple grace his father used to say every Christmas, word for word, and for a moment I felt something soften in my chest. Some old hope that maybe things could still be all right between us after everything. We ate turkey, and my own sweet potato casserole, the one I'd made every year since before David was born, the recipe card stained and soft with age in my kitchen drawer at home, and the children told stories about school, about a class hamster and an upcoming spelling bee, and I let myself enjoy it, truly enjoy it, because I had decided months earlier that I would not let this family's cruelty steal every single good moment from me, not even the ones happening on the way toward something painful I already knew was coming that night. It happened right after dessert, right as I was pouring myself a second cup of coffee, the pot still warm in my hand against the cold air by the window. Jessica stood up, tapped her fork gently against her wine glass the way people do before a toast, and the whole table quieted down, looking at her with warm, expectant faces, like she was about to announce good news, maybe a new baby, maybe a promotion at work. "I want to share something wonderful," she said, smiling directly at me, her voice carrying easily across the whole table. "Starting next year, Dorothy is going to be moving into Meadowbrook Senior Living, such a beautiful, caring place, and we couldn't be more relieved knowing she'll finally be safe and taken care of. Won't that be such a relief for everyone at this table?" There was a small round of applause, an actual small round of applause, hands meeting softly around that table from people who genuinely believed they were celebrating something kind and generous being done for me. My sister-in-law said, "Oh, Dorothy, that's wonderful. How exciting for you at your age. Isn't that a relief?" One of the neighbors said something about how lovely that facility was supposed to be, how her own mother had looked at a similar place once, years ago. And I sat there, in my good navy blue sweater, holding my coffee cup steady with both hands so it wouldn't shake, while my own family congratulated my daughter-in-law for successfully relocating me out of my own life, without ever once asking if I wanted to go, if I had any say in the matter at all that night. I smiled. I want you to understand that I actually smiled, genuinely, and I meant it, though not for the reason anyone at that table thought I meant it in that moment. I said, "Thank you for thinking of me, dear. That's very thoughtful of you." And I watched Jessica's face light up with satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of someone who believes they have just solved a difficult problem gracefully and publicly, earning credit for it in the very same breath they solved it in. Nobody at that table, not my son, not my sister-in-law, not one single person gathered there that evening thought to ask me a single question about my own preferences, my own life, my own future, my own opinion on where I might want to spend whatever years I had left. And that, more than the nursing home itself, was the wound underneath everything, the part that actually kept me awake that whole night. January came, and the adaptation visit Jessica had arranged took place on a bright, cold Saturday morning. Frost still clinging to the car windshields when we all met up in the driveway. She had genuinely put effort into it, coordinating with what she believed was simply a helpful staff member she'd spoken to on the phone, bringing along David's sister, two of the neighbors, even a small gift basket for me wrapped in ribbon, like we were celebrating a graduation instead of what she thought was my quiet, dignified surrender to old age. We walked into the lobby of Meadowbrook Senior Living together, 7 of us in our winter coats stamping snow off our boots. And Jessica turned to me with genuine warmth in her eyes and said, "Isn't it beautiful, Dorothy? Doesn't this already feel like somewhere you could be happy living out your days? It was beautiful." I had made sure of that for 30 straight years, every fixture, every carpet sample, every light bulb chosen for warmth instead of that harsh institutional glare you find in cheaper places. The lobby had fresh flowers, changed twice a week without fail, a pianist playing softly near the fireplace, sunlight coming through tall windows onto a floor I had personally chosen the tile for after 3 different vendor meetings that ran late into the evening years ago. And standing there to greet us, exactly as we had planned 2 weeks earlier over the phone, was Nancy Ellison, dressed professionally in her navy blazer, holding a small leather folder under her arm, her face calm and warm, giving nothing away except the smallest flicker of a look toward me, a look only I would have caught after 30 years of reading every expression on that woman's face. Nancy welcomed everyone warmly, thanked Jessica by name for arranging the visit, complimenting her thoughtfulness in front of the whole group. Then she said she wanted to properly introduce the newest and actually the most important person joining their community this year. She turned toward me with a genuine, respectful smile and said, "Everyone, I would like you to formally meet Dorothy Whitfield, majority owner of Meadowbrook Senior Living, and the woman who built this entire community from a single rented office 30 years ago with nothing but grit and a small loan nobody thought she'd repay." She opened the leather folder and held up for the whole group to see clearly the operating agreement with my name printed clearly at the top in plain black ink, unmistakable, undeniable, exactly where it had always quietly been. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever heard in my entire 78 years of life. Jessica's smile didn't fall all at once. It sort of froze first, then slowly cracked, the way ice cracks on a pond right before it actually gives way beneath your feet without warning. My sister-in-law's mouth literally fell open, one hand rising slowly to cover it in shock. One of the neighbors actually laughed, a short, startled laugh, before catching herself and looking around nervously at everyone else's faces. David turned to look at me with an expression I had never once seen on his face in 40 years of being his mother, somewhere between shock, shame, and something that looked almost like relief, like a held breath finally let go after a very long time. "Jessica," I said gently, no anger in my voice at all, keeping my hands folded calmly in front of me the way I always do, because I had decided months earlier that anger was not going to be the tool I used in this particular moment. "This is the same Meadowbrook you showed me a brochure for at Thanksgiving, right there on the table next to the cranberry sauce, remember? This is the place I built the year after your husband was born, back when I was scared out of my mind and had nobody in the world to help me carry any of it alone." I have owned the majority of this business for 3 full decades now, and I want you to know I am not angry that you looked into a nursing home for me. I am only sorry it took a stranger's folder, held up in a lobby, to finally make you ask a question about who I actually am underneath all of this. Nancy handled the rest of that morning beautifully, giving the group an actual tour, showing off the physical therapy room, the dining hall with its white tablecloths and fresh centerpieces, the sunny activity room where residents were finishing up a watercolor class, the little library I had stocked myself with large print books over many years. But nobody in our family was really looking at the building anymore. Not really, not with the same eyes as before. They were looking at me differently, some of them for what felt like the first time in years, really seeing me instead of a category they'd already filed me under. Jessica walked quietly the entire tour, her earlier confidence completely gone from her posture, replying only in short, careful sentences whenever anyone asked her a direct question, her eyes darting toward me every few minutes, like she was checking whether I'd forgiven her yet or ever would. That evening, back at David's house, after the neighbors and his sister had gone home and the dishes were finally done and put away, the kitchen quiet again for the first time all day, David sat down next to me on the couch, something he hadn't done in longer than I could honestly remember anymore, and he apologized. Not a quick, easy apology either, not the kind you toss off just to end an awkward silence in the room. He cried a little, actually cried shoulders shaking under the lamplight, and told me he was ashamed of himself. Ashamed that he had let his own mother be talked about instead of talked to for an entire year. Ashamed that his fear of disappointing Gary had made him small in a way his own father never would have allowed himself to be. Not for one single day of his whole life. I told David the truth, plainly, the way I've always talked to him since he was a little boy, learning to ride a bike in our old driveway with me running behind him. I told him I forgave him because he is my son and I love him more than anything else in this entire world, but that forgiveness didn't mean things could simply go back to exactly how they were before, sliding quietly into the same old comfortable patterns. I told him I expected to be consulted about my own life from now on, every single decision, every plan, every conversation about my house or my health or my future, no exceptions made for anyone. And that if that expectation wasn't respected going forward, consequences would follow that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with boundaries I should have set for myself years earlier in life. Jessica and I had our own conversation about a week later, just the two of us. No David, no children, over coffee at my kitchen table, the same table she'd once suggested I might be too confused to sit at alone and manage my own checkbook properly. She apologized too, though it came out stiff and careful at first, more embarrassed than truly sorry, I think, at least in that very first conversation between the two of us. I told her plainly that I understood her father's money had put pressure on her and David both, in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until all of this happened, and that fear does strange things to people who feel like they have no safety net of their own to fall back on. But I also told her, looking her right in the eye across that table, that fear was never an excuse for deciding someone else's entire future without asking them a single honest question first. In practical terms, quite a lot changed after that January morning, changes you could point to and measure clearly on paper, not just feelings floating around unspoken between us at holidays. I formally updated my estate plan with Susan, clarifying exactly how Meadowbrook would be managed and eventually passed down to the family, with specific protections written in so that no future decision about the business or about me personally could ever be made without my direct involvement while I'm still alive and of sound mind. David took on a real documented role at Meadowbrook, learning the business properly from Nancy from the ground floor up, starting with payroll and scheduling just like I once did, for the first time in his adult life, earning something on his own merit instead of simply being handed comfort through his father-in-law, Gary's checkbook. Jessica, for her part, stepped back from making family decisions the way she used to before all of this happened. Not banished exactly from our lives, still present at every holiday gathering, still bringing her famous green bean casserole every single Thanksgiving without fail, still a wonderful mother to my grandchildren whom I love completely and without condition, but noticeably quieter now around me, noticeably more careful with her words at the dinner table, noticeably aware that the ground under her old assumptions was not nearly as solid as she'd once so confidently believed it to be. Ethan and Mia started coming to see me again almost every single weekend, tumbling out of the car the second it stopped moving in my driveway, dragging their backpacks and their homework, and their questions about the old business straight through my front door, and this time nobody explained it away as tiring me out or needing a rest. I go to Meadowbrook now, my Meadowbrook, at least twice a week, walking those same halls I walked 30 years ago as a terrified young widow with nothing but a business plan and pure stubbornness to her name, stopping in every room to ask each resident how their week has actually been, not just how they're doing. I sit on the board meetings now, my reading glasses pushed up on my nose, my notes scrolled in the margins the exact way I've always done it since the beginning. I make decisions about resident care personally, the way I always did before I quietly stepped back out of some misplaced sense of humility that nearly cost me everything. And every single time I walk through that lobby with the flowers and the pianist and the sunlight on the tile I picked myself all those years ago, I remember exactly who decided on her own, without anyone's permission at all, that this was the year she finally stopped disappearing from her own life. Here is what I want you to understand from my story. More than any single detail about nursing homes or family dinners or documents in leather folders held up in a lobby full of shocked, silent faces that morning. Being older does not mean being invisible. Needing help with some things, a ride to the doctor, a hand with the groceries, does not mean you forfeit the right to be consulted about your own life, your own money, your own home, your own future. If anyone in your family has started talking about you instead of to you, deciding your future in gentle, reasonable-sounding sentences that somehow always end with you having less say over your own life than you had the day before, that is not kindness, no matter how warmly it's delivered with a smile over coffee, and you are allowed, fully and completely allowed, to say so out loud, plainly, without apology. I am not angry anymore, not at Jessica, not really even at David for the year he spent being too weak to speak up for me at that table, watching me get smaller in that family's eyes while he stayed quiet beside her. I understand fear now better than I did before all this happened to me. Fear of money, fear of disappointing people who hold power over your comfort and your future, fear of disagreeing with someone louder and more certain sounding than you feel. But understanding fear doesn't mean accepting silence, not from other people ever again, and honestly, not from yourself either, not for one more year of your life. I spent one Christmas dinner smiling politely while my whole life was decided without me at that table, and I promised myself driving home alone in the dark that night it would be the very last time that ever happened to me for as long as I lived. If my story reminded you even a little of your own life, of your own mother, your own grandmother, your own aunt, or maybe even yourself sitting somewhere quiet tonight thinking it over long after the video should have ended, I hope you'll remember one thing above everything else I've told you tonight. You get to have a voice in your own story, at every single age, right up until the very end of it, no matter what anyone else decides is convenient for them. Nobody, no matter how much they love you, no matter how reasonable their tone sounds over coffee or turkey or Christmas pie, gets to quietly write you out of decisions about your own future without ever asking you a single honest question first. Plainly, to your face. Thank you so much for sitting with me through this whole story tonight, all the way to the very end of it, whoever and wherever you are listening from right now. If it touched something in you, if you'd like to hear more stories like mine about women who found their voice again after being underestimated by the very people who were supposed to know them best in this world, please subscribe to this channel completely free of charge. It truly does help keep these stories alive and reaching the people who need them most, exactly when they need them the most. I'm Dorothy, and I hope wherever you are sitting tonight, in whatever kind of room you're in right now, you remember that your voice still matters at every age, in every room you walk into, always without exception, for as long as you live.